The little girl's voice cut through the empty hallway like a knife. "Please, mister! They're beating my mom! She's dying!" Frank looked down at the child, no more than 6 years old, her face streaked with tears, her tiny hands grabbing at his janitor's uniform. Behind the locked door of the corner office on the 20th floor, he could hear muffled thuds, a woman's scream abruptly silenced. CEO Carolyn Barrett. He'd seen her name on the directory every day for 2 years, never imagining this moment. The girl pulled harder. "They said they'll kill her if she doesn't sign." 30 minutes. That's all the time they had before those men finished what they started. 8 years ago, Frank had frozen when his partner begged for help, and that moment of cowardice had haunted every day since. His hands were shaking now, the old fear rising like ice water in his chest. But this child was looking at him like he was her only hope. One last chance to stop running from who he used to be. Frank had been invisible for 8 years. That was the point. Every morning at 5, he clocked in at the Barrett Industries tower, pushed his cart through marble lobbies and executive suites, emptied trash cans, wiped down glass doors that reflected a man who looked older than his 52 years. The building hummed with importance, deals worth millions, careers built on ambition, but none of it touched him. He kept his head down, his voice quiet, his past buried so deep he sometimes convinced himself it belonged to someone else. The 20th floor was his territory on Fridays. Corner offices with views of the city skyline, conference rooms where decisions got made. And at the end of the hall, the largest suite belonged to Carolyn Barrett. He'd seen her exactly 3 times in 2 years. Once stepping out of the elevator with her daughter, both of them laughing about something. Once through the glass walls of a conference room, her voice sharp and certain as she pointed at projections on a screen. Once in the lobby at 6 in the morning, her heels clicking against marble, a coffee in one hand and her phone in the other, already working before the sun came up. She never looked at him. Nobody did. That was how he wanted it. Friday afternoon, the floor was quiet. Most executives left early for the weekend, their assistants already gone, the hallways empty except for the low hum of ventilation and the distant ping of elevator arrivals. Frank worked methodically, the rhythm familiar and calming. Wipe down the water cooler, empty the recycling bins, check the bathroom supplies. His mind was blank, the way he'd trained it to be, focused only on the next task, the next surface, the next room. Then he heard the rustling footsteps, small, frantic, echoing off the polished floors. He turned just as the girl crashed into him, her momentum nearly knocking his cart over. She couldn't have been more than 6, maybe 7, her dark hair tangled, her face flushed and wet with tears. Her hands clutched at his uniform, and when she looked up at him, her eyes were wide with terror that no child should ever know. "Please," she gasped, her voice breaking. "Please, mister, you have to help. They're hurting my mom." Her words tumbled out in a rush, barely coherent. "Bad men. They came in. They locked the door." She pulled at him, trying to drag him down the hall with strength that seemed impossible for someone so small. "She's dying. Please." Frank's first instinct was to step back, to find a phone, to call security. That was the protocol. That was the safe choice. But the girl's grip was iron, and when he looked past her down the hallway, he saw the corner office door closed, and through the frosted glass, shadows moving in violent jerks. A heavy thud, the sound of something breaking, then silence, the kind that felt like held breath. "They said they'll kill her if she doesn't sign the paper," the girl sobbed. They said... Her voice dissolved into crying, and Frank felt something crack inside his chest, something he'd kept locked away for 8 years. He knelt down, putting himself at eye level with her. "What's your name?" His voice came out rough, unused to urgency. "Zoe," she whispered. "Zoe Barrett. That's my mom in there. Please, you have to do something. Nobody else is here. Just you." Just him. Frank looked at the closed door again, then at the emergency exit sign at the end of the hall, then back at the child whose entire world was collapsing behind frosted glass. His hands were shaking. The old fear was there, cold and familiar, whispering all the reasons to walk away. Call the police. Let the professionals handle it. You're just a janitor now. You're nobody. You can't help. But Zoe was looking at him like he was everything. Like he was the only person in the world who could save her mother. And somewhere in the locked office, a woman was running out of time. Frank stood up. His legs felt unsteady, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Zoe," he said quietly, "I need you to go to the stairwell and wait for me there. Can you do that?" She shook her head violently, her hands still gripping his uniform. "I can't leave her. I can't." "You have to," Frank said, and this time his voice was steadier, the tone he'd used a lifetime ago when lives depended on clear orders. "I'm going to help your mom, but I need you safe first. Go to the stairs. Don't come out until I come get you. Understand?" She hesitated, her eyes searching his face for something, reassurance maybe, or proof that he could do what he said. Whatever she saw there made her nod. She released his uniform and ran toward the stairwell, glancing back once before the door swung shut behind her. Frank was alone in the hallway. The silence felt enormous, pressing against his ears. He could walk away right now, call 911 from the lobby, let the police handle it, nobody would blame him. Nobody even knew he was here. But he was moving toward the office before the thought finished forming. His body remembered what his mind had tried to forget. The way his pulse slowed instead of sped up when danger came close, the way his vision sharpened, the way every sound became distinct and measurable. 8 years ago, he'd frozen when it mattered. His partner had called for backup, and Frank had hesitated, just for a moment, just long enough for everything to go wrong. The bullet had caught his partner in the chest. Frank had watched him die on a rooftop in Istanbul while the target escaped. He'd turned in his resignation the next day. Now, standing outside Carolyn Barrett's office, he could hear voices inside. Male. Rough. 3, maybe 4 of them. One was speaking in a low, threatening tone. "Last chance, lady. Sign the contract or we stop being nice." A woman's voice, strained but defiant. "Go to hell." The sound of a fist hitting flesh. A sharp cry of pain. Frank tested the door handle, locked from inside. The glass was frosted, impossible to see through clearly, but the shadows were enough. 4 figures standing, one on the ground. He stepped back, surveying the hallway. His cart was still where Zoe had crashed into it. Cleaning supplies, a mop, bottles of industrial cleaner. Nothing useful. But 10 feet away was a fire extinguisher mounted on the wall. He pulled it free, feeling the weight in his hands. 20 pounds of metal and pressurized chemical. It would have to be enough. Frank positioned himself beside the door, out of the line of sight from inside, and slammed the base of the extinguisher into the glass. The frosted pane shattered with a sound like ice breaking, and before the men inside could react, he was through the opening, glass crunching under his shoes. The office was large, decorated with the kind of minimalist luxury that spoke of success and control. None of that mattered now. Carolyn Barrett was on the floor near her desk, her face bloody, her expensive blouse torn. 4 men in dark suits stood around her, and all of them turned toward Frank with expressions of surprise that quickly shifted to contempt. "The hell?" one of them said, a tall man with a scar running down his jaw. "It's the janitor." He laughed, and the others joined in. "You lost, old man. This is private business." Frank didn't answer. He was calculating distances, angles, threats. The scarred man had a gun holstered under his jacket. Frank could see the bulge. The one nearest to Carolyn had his hand on her shoulder, keeping her down. The other 2 were blocking the path to the door. All of them were younger, stronger, confident in their numbers. "Get out," the scarred man said, his voice harder now, "or you're going to regret being a hero." Frank's hands tightened on the fire extinguisher. His mouth was dry. The fear was there, trying to freeze him again, trying to remind him of Istanbul, of the moment he'd failed. But Carolyn was looking at him now, her eyes wide with pain and confusion, and somewhere in the stairwell, her daughter was waiting. "Let her go," Frank said quietly. "Walk away, and nobody gets hurt." The scarred man pulled his gun. "Wrong answer." Frank moved. Not away from the gun, but toward it, closing the distance before the man could aim properly. He swung the fire extinguisher in a tight arc, catching the man's wrist with the metal base. The gun clattered to the floor. Frank didn't stop. He drove his shoulder into the man's chest, using momentum to slam him into the wall, then brought the extinguisher up into his jaw. The man dropped. The other three were already moving. Frank spun, pulling the pin on the extinguisher and blasting white chemical foam into the face of the nearest attacker. The man stumbled back, clawing at his eyes. Frank dropped the extinguisher and grabbed the second man's arm as he swung a punch, redirecting the force and using it to throw him over his hip. The man hit the floor hard, the air rushing out of his lungs. 2 down, 2 still standing. The one who'd had his hand on Carolyn was backing toward the desk, reaching for something. Probably another weapon. The fourth man, larger than the others, was circling Frank with the wary posture of someone who knew how to fight. Frank's breath was coming harder now, his heart pounding, but his mind was clear. This was what he'd been trained for. This was who he used to be. The large man lunged, fast for his size. Frank sidestepped, but not quite fast enough. A fist clipped his shoulder, sending pain shooting down his arm. He countered with a strike to the man's kidney, then another to the back of his knee. The man grunted but didn't go down. He grabbed Frank's shirt and yanked him forward, trying to headbutt him. Frank twisted, taking the impact on his shoulder instead of his face, then drove his elbow into the man's throat. The grip loosened. Frank followed with a knee to the stomach, and finally the man collapsed. 3 down. The last one had found what he was looking for, a letter opener from Carolyn's desk, 8 inches of metal with a sharp point. He held it like a knife, his expression desperate now, all the earlier confidence gone. "Stay back," he warned, his voice shaking. "I'll kill you, old man. I swear I will." Frank didn't move. His shoulder was throbbing where he'd been hit, and he could feel bruises forming on his ribs. He wasn't young anymore. His body was reminding him of that with every breath. But he kept his eyes on the man with the letter opener, watching for the telltale signs. The shift of weight, the tension in the arm, the moment before action. It came. The man rushed forward, the makeshift weapon aimed at Frank's chest. Frank caught his wrist mid-thrust, twisted hard, and heard something crack. The letter opener fell. Frank swept the man's legs out from under him and put him face down on the floor, one arm pinned behind his back. The man struggled for a moment, then went still, whimpering. The office was quiet except for heavy breathing. Frank's, Carolyn's, the groans of the men on the floor. Frank released his grip and stepped back, his legs suddenly unsteady. The adrenaline was draining away, leaving exhaustion in its place. He looked at Carolyn, who was staring at him with an expression he couldn't read. Shock, maybe, or disbelief. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice hoarse. She nodded slowly, wincing as she touched her split lip. "I think so. Who are you?" Before Frank could answer, the scarred man, the first one he'd hit, stirred on the floor, his hand scrabbling toward where his gun had fallen. Frank saw it happening as if in slow motion, the man's fingers closing around the grip, the barrel swinging toward Carolyn. No time to think, no time to plan. Frank threw himself forward, putting his body between the gun and the woman on the floor. The shot was deafening in the enclosed space. Frank felt the impact like a hammer to his side, just below his ribs. Heat and pain exploded through him. He staggered, fell to one knee, but forced himself to keep moving. He grabbed the gun from the scarred man's hand and struck him across the temple with it. The man went limp. Frank dropped the gun and pressed his hand to his side. Blood was seeping between his fingers, hot and slick. The pain was worse now, sharp and insistent, but his mind was still working, still calculating. Shallow entry wound, probably missed vital organs. He'd survive if he didn't bleed out. Big if. "Oh my God," Carolyn was saying, crawling toward him. "You're shot, you're—" She pulled off her blazer and pressed it against his wound, her hands shaking. "Why did you do that? Why did you—" "Your daughter," Frank managed, his breath coming in short gasps. "Zoe. She's in the stairwell. She's safe." Carolyn's face crumpled, tears mixing with the blood on her cheeks. "You saved us. You—" Her voice broke. "I don't even know your name." "Frank," he said. "Just Frank." The edges of his vision were starting to blur. He could hear sirens in the distance, getting closer. Zoe must have called 911 from the stairwell, or maybe someone else in the building had heard the gunshot. Either way, help was coming. He just had to stay conscious until they got here. "Just Frank," Carolyn repeated, her voice fierce despite the tears. "You're not just anything. You saved my life. My daughter's life." She kept pressure on his wound, talking to keep him alert. "Who are you really? Where did you learn to fight like that?" Frank's head was getting heavy. The pain was fading into numbness, which probably wasn't a good sign. "Long time ago," he murmured. "Different life. Different person." "What happened?" she asked softly. "Why are you working as a janitor if you can do—" She gestured at the unconscious men around them. "All of this." The sirens were louder now, probably in the parking garage below. Frank closed his eyes, and for a moment he was back on that rooftop in Istanbul, watching his partner die, feeling the weight of his own cowardice. "I failed someone," he said quietly. "When it mattered most, I froze. He died because of me. I didn't deserve to be who I was after that." "But you didn't freeze today," Carolyn said. "You saved us." Frank opened his eyes and looked at her. "Your daughter didn't give me a choice. She looked at me like I was the only one who could help. I couldn't let her down." The office door burst open. Police flooded in, weapons drawn, shouting commands. Paramedics followed close behind. Frank felt Carolyn's hands pulled away from his wound as professionals took over, checking vitals, applying pressure, loading him onto a stretcher. Through the chaos, he caught a glimpse of Zoe running into the room, throwing herself at her mother, both of them crying and holding each other. Zoe looked over at him as the paramedics wheeled him toward the door. Their eyes met. She mouthed 2 words. "Thank you." Frank managed a small nod before they took him away. As the elevator descended toward the ambulance waiting below, he felt something he hadn't felt in 8 years. Not redemption exactly. Not yet. But maybe, just maybe, the possibility of it. The doors closed, and everything went dark. Frank woke to the sterile smell of disinfectant and the steady beep of monitors. The hospital room was dim, late afternoon sun filtering through half-closed blinds. His side felt like someone had driven a spike through it, then left it there to rust. He tried to sit up and immediately regretted it, a groan escaping before he could stop it. "Don't move!" The voice came from the corner of the room. A man in his 40s, suit jacket draped over the back of a chair, badge clipped to his belt. "Detective," Frank guessed. The man stood and walked closer, pulling out a notepad. "I'm Detective Morris. You're Frank Hayward, is that right? Or should I say, former CIA operative Frank Hayward?" Frank's jaw tightened. So they'd run his prints. Of course they had. That was a long time ago, he said, his voice rough from the anesthesia. I'm just a janitor now. Just a janitor who took down 4 armed men and saved the life of one of the city's most prominent CEOs. Morris said, his tone neutral but his eyes sharp. The security footage from the hallway shows the little girl running to you. Shows you breaking into that office. Shows what happened after. He paused. Miss Barrett says you threw yourself in front of a bullet meant for her. That true? Frank didn't answer right away. His mind was still foggy, but the memories were coming back in sharp fragments. Zoe's terrified face. Carolyn on the floor, the gun swinging toward her. The decision that happened faster than thought. Is she all right? He asked instead. And her daughter? They're fine. Shaken up, but fine. Ms. Barrett's been here twice already asking about you. The girl, too. Morris sat down on the edge of the bed, his expression softening slightly. Look, I'm not here to give you a hard time. You're a hero, far as anyone's concerned. But I need to understand what happened in that room. Those men are connected to the Konstantin crime family. This wasn't some random attack. They wanted Ms. Barrett to sign over shares of her company to front their money laundering operation. When she refused, they got violent. He looked at Frank with something like curiosity. How does a janitor know how to fight like that? Training doesn't go away just because you stop using it, Frank said quietly. I saw someone in trouble. I did what I could. Morris studied him for a long moment, then nodded. The men you put down are all in custody. The one you shot, well, the one who shot himself after you redirected his aim. He's singing like a canary, trying to cut a deal. Says the whole thing was ordered by Vincent Konstantin himself. He flipped his notepad closed. Miss Barrett's given her statement. She's pushing hard to make sure you're treated as the victim here, not as someone who'll get caught up in bureaucracy. She's got a lot of pull in this city, and she's using all of it for you. Frank closed his eyes, exhaustion pulling at him. I don't need special treatment. I just want to make sure they're safe. They are. For now. Morris stood, tucking the notepad into his pocket. But the Konstantin family doesn't forget. You humiliated them, put 4 of their guys in the hospital and 3 more in lockup. They'll want payback. He pulled a business card from his wallet and set it on the bedside table. You think of anything else, you call me. And Frank? He paused at the door. Whatever happened in your past that made you stop being an operative, it's not my business. But what you did today? That took guts. Don't let anyone tell you different. The detective left, and Frank was alone with the beeping monitors and the pain in his side. He stared at the ceiling, his mind drifting back 8 years. Istanbul had been a routine extraction mission. Get the defector out, avoid detection, report back. Simple. Except his partner, Danny Ortiz, had spotted a secondary target, a bomb maker the agency had been tracking for months. Danny had wanted to take him down while they had the chance. Frank had argued against it. Too risky. Stick to the mission. But Danny had gone anyway, and Frank had followed, because that's what partners did. They'd cornered the target on a rooftop, and that's when everything fell apart. The bomb maker had backup. Shots were fired. Danny had called for Frank to cover him, to move in, to do something. And Frank had frozen. Just for 3 seconds. Maybe 4. But it was enough. The bullet had caught Danny in the chest, and by the time Frank's body remembered how to move, it was too late. He'd carried Danny's body down 6 flights of stairs. He'd made the extraction point, he'd filed the report. But he couldn't file away the image of Danny's eyes going dark, or the sound of his last breath rattling in his throat. The agency had cleared him. Operational hazard. No fault assigned. But Frank knew the truth. Danny had died because his partner hesitated. And a man who hesitated didn't deserve to carry a weapon or a badge or the responsibility of other people's lives. So he'd walked away, found the quietest job he could, became invisible. For 8 years he'd scrubbed floors and emptied trash cans and convinced himself he was paying penance. But penance didn't bring Danny back. It didn't change what happened. It just made him feel like he was doing something, even if that something was nothing at all. A soft knock on the door pulled him back to the present. "Come in," he said, expecting a nurse. Instead, Carolyn Barrett stepped into the room, and behind her, holding her hand, was Zoe. The girl's eyes were red-rimmed but bright, and when she saw Frank, her face lit up with a smile that made his chest ache. "You're awake," Carolyn said, relief evident in her voice. She looked different without the blood and fear, still exhausted, a bandage on her temple and bruises darkening her jaw, but steady, strong. "We've been waiting to see you. The doctors said you'd be okay, but I needed to see for myself." Zoe let go of her mother's hand and ran to the bedside. "You saved us," she said, her voice small but certain. "You're a hero. Mom said so." Frank shook his head slightly. "I'm not a hero, Zoe. I just did what anyone would do." "No," Carolyn said firmly, moving closer. "Not anyone. Most people would have called 911 and waited. You didn't. You put yourself between my daughter and danger, and then between me and a bullet." Her voice wavered. "The doctors said another inch to the left and it would have hit your liver. You could have died." "But I didn't," Frank said. "And you're both safe. That's what matters." Carolyn pulled up a chair and sat down, keeping one hand on Zoe's shoulder. "The detective told me about your background. CIA, years of service, commendations." She paused. "He also said you left the agency 8 years ago and just disappeared. Why?" Frank looked at Zoe, then back at Carolyn. "Not a conversation for right now," he said quietly. Carolyn nodded, understanding. "Zoe, sweetheart, can you go ask the nurse if Mr. Frank can have some water?" The girl hesitated, then nodded and slipped out of the room. As soon as the door closed, Carolyn leaned forward. "I need to know who you are," she said, her voice low but intense. "Not just your name or your job title. I need to know why a man with your skills has been cleaning my office building for 2 years without anyone knowing what you're capable of. Because those men today, they weren't amateurs, and you took them down like it was nothing." "It wasn't nothing," Frank said. "I got shot." A flicker of a smile crossed her face, but it faded quickly. "You know what I mean. Please, you saved my life and my daughter's life. I deserve to know why you were there, why you helped, why you threw yourself in front of a gun." Frank was quiet for a long moment, weighing how much to say. But something in Carolyn's eyes, the directness, the refusal to accept half-truths, made him decide. 8 years ago, I was on a mission in Istanbul. My partner got killed because I hesitated when he needed me. I froze and he paid the price. He kept his gaze on the ceiling, unable to look at her. After that, I couldn't do the job anymore. Couldn't trust myself. So I left. Found the quietest, most invisible work I could find. I thought if I just stayed out of the way, maybe I'd stop seeing his face every time I closed my eyes. "Did it work?" Carolyn asked softly. Frank finally looked at her. "No, not even a little." She nodded slowly, as if confirming something she already knew. "When Zoe ran to you today, when she begged you to help, what did you feel?" "Terror," Frank admitted. The same fear that froze me before. The certainty that I'd fail again, that someone else would die because I wasn't good enough. He paused. But then I thought about what it would mean if I walked away, what it would do to her. And I couldn't. I couldn't let that little girl watch her mother die because I was too afraid to try. Carolyn reached out and took his hand, her grip firm despite the bruises on her knuckles. You didn't freeze today. You moved. You fought. You saved us. Whatever happened 8 years ago, whatever you think you owe your partner, you paid it forward today. You gave my daughter her mother back. You gave me my life back. Her eyes were shining with tears she refused to let fall. That has to count for something. Frank wanted to believe her. He wanted to feel the weight lift, to feel the ghost of Danny finally let go. But guilt had been his companion for so long, he didn't know how to exist without it. I'm glad you're safe, he said instead. Both of you. That's all that matters. Zoe came back then, a nurse following with a pitcher of water. The girl climbed into the chair next to her mother and looked at Frank with solemn eyes. Are you going to be okay? She asked. Will you have to stay here long? Just a few days, the nurse said cheerfully, checking Frank's IV. He's healing well. Tough guy. She winked at Zoe and left them alone again. Carolyn stood, gently guiding Zoe to her feet. We should let you rest, but I'm coming back tomorrow, and we're going to talk about what happens next. Frank frowned. What happens next is I get out of here and go back to work. No, Carolyn said, her CEO voice emerging, the one that didn't allow for argument. What happens next is you let me figure out how to thank you properly. And we talk about your future, because it's not going to be pushing a mop cart through my building. Not after this. Before he could protest, she held up a hand. I'm not asking. I'm telling. You saved my life, Frank Hayward. That means I get a say in what you do with yours now. At least for a little while. She leaned down and kissed his forehead, a gesture so unexpected and gentle that Frank didn't know how to respond. Zoe hugged his arm carefully, avoiding his injury. Thank you for saving my mom, she whispered. You're the bravest person I ever met. Then they were gone, and Frank was alone again with the monitors and the pain and the strange, unfamiliar feeling that maybe, just maybe, he'd done something right. The next 3 days passed in a blur of doctors, pain medication, and visits from people Frank hadn't expected. Detective Morris came back twice, updating him on the investigation. The Konstantin family was scrambling, their operation exposed, key members under arrest. Vincent Konstantin himself was rumored to have fled the country. The 4 men Frank had fought were cooperating with prosecutors, hoping for reduced sentences. The threat wasn't gone completely, Morris warned, but it was significantly diminished. Carolyn came every afternoon, sometimes with Zoe, sometimes alone. She brought books, food from restaurants far better than hospital cafeteria fare, and a steady stream of conversation that pulled Frank out of his own head. She talked about her company, about the challenges of being a female CEO in a male-dominated industry, about raising Zoe alone after her husband had died in a car accident 4 years ago. She talked about fear and resilience and the strange way life put people exactly where they needed to be at exactly the right moment. Frank found himself talking, too, more than he had in years. About Danny, about the missions that had shaped him, about the slow erosion of confidence that had led to that moment on the rooftop, about the 8 years of silence and invisibility that followed. Carolyn listened without judgment, asking questions that made him think, pushing back when he tried to diminish his own role in what happened. You made a mistake, she said on the 3rd day, sitting in the chair by his bed while Zoe colored at the small table by the window. A terrible, tragic mistake. But you were in an impossible situation, making split-second decisions that most people will never have to make. And instead of forgiving yourself, you've spent 8 years in exile, punishing yourself for being human. She leaned forward. Danny wouldn't have wanted that, would he? Frank thought about Danny's laugh, his terrible jokes, the way he'd always found something to be optimistic about, even in the darkest situations. No, he admitted. He'd have told me to stop being dramatic and get back to work. Then maybe it's time you listened, Carolyn said gently. On the 4th day, Frank was cleared to leave. A nurse wheeled him down to the lobby, despite his protests that he could walk, and when the automatic doors opened to the cool morning air, he saw Carolyn's car waiting at the curb. She stepped out, dressed in jeans and a sweater, looking more relaxed than he'd ever seen her. Zoe bounced in the back seat, waving enthusiastically. "What are you doing?" Frank asked as Carolyn helped him into the passenger seat. "I can take a cab." "To where?" she asked, buckling his seatbelt like he was one of her employees who needed managing. "Your apartment? That tiny studio you've been living in for 2 years? I don't think so." She closed his door and walked around to the driver's side. "You're coming home with us, just for a week or so, until you're healed enough to take care of yourself." "Carolyn, I can't." She started the engine. "You can, and you will. I have a guest room. Zoe wants to make sure you're okay. And frankly, after what you did for us, you don't get to argue." She pulled into traffic, ignoring his protests. "Besides, we need to talk about your job situation." "I have a job," Frank said. "Had," Carolyn corrected. "I spoke with building management. You're on indefinite medical leave, fully paid. When you're ready to come back, there will be a position waiting, but not as a janitor." She glanced at him. "I'm starting a private security division for the company. Executive protection, threat assessment, crisis management. I want you to run it." Frank stared at her. "You can't be serious." "I'm always serious when it comes to business," she said. "You have skills that are being wasted. You have experience that could save lives. And after what happened, I've realized how vulnerable we all are. I need someone I can trust, someone who's proven they'll put themselves on the line when it matters. That's you, Frank." She pulled up to a red light and turned to look at him fully. "I'm not asking you to go back to being a CIA operative. I'm asking you to use what you know to protect people, to build something new, and to stop hiding from who you are." Zoe piped up from the back seat. "Plus, you can teach me cool stuff, like how to fight bad guys." Carolyn laughed. "Maybe when you're older, sweetheart, much older." Frank felt something loosening in his chest, a knot he'd carried for so long he'd forgotten it was there. "I don't know if I can do this," he said quietly. "What if I freeze again? What if someone gets hurt because of me?" "Then we'll deal with it," Carolyn said simply. "But I don't think you will. You didn't freeze when it mattered most. You saved us, and I believe you'll keep saving people if you give yourself the chance." The light turned green, and she drove forward, toward a neighborhood Frank had only seen from the outside, where houses had yards and trees and the kind of settled permanence he'd never allowed himself to imagine. "Just think about it," Carolyn said. "You don't have to decide today, or tomorrow. Just heal. Spend time with us. Let yourself be more than the man who made one mistake 8 years ago." Frank looked out the window, watching the city pass by. For the first time in longer than he could remember, he felt something other than guilt. Not quite hope. Not yet. But maybe the beginning of it. The foundation on which hope could be built. Carolyn's house was everything Frank had imagined, and nothing he'd expected. Warm. Lived in. Full of Zoe's artwork and family photos, and the kind of comfortable chaos that came from an actual life being lived. The guest room had a real bed and windows that let in afternoon sun and a bookshelf full of novels. Carolyn showed him where everything was, gave him space to settle in, and then left him alone with instructions to rest and call if he needed anything. That night, Frank sat in the living room while Zoe did homework at the dining table and Carolyn cooked dinner. It was painfully domestic, almost surreal after years of solitude. But it was also easy, natural, like slipping into a role he'd forgotten he could play. They ate together, talked about Zoe's school day, avoided any mention of the violence that had brought them to this moment. After dinner, Zoe insisted on showing Frank her room, proudly displaying her rock collection and the telescope her mother had bought for her birthday. "I want to be an astronaut," she told him seriously. "Or maybe a superhero. I haven't decided yet." Frank smiled, the expression feeling strange on his face. "You could be both. Astronauts are kind of like superheroes." "Are you a superhero?" Zoe asked. "Sort of," Frank said carefully. "I just did what needed to be done." "That's what superheroes do," Zoe said, as if it were obvious. "They do what needs to be done even when they're scared. Mom told me you were scared, but you saved us anyway. That's the bravest kind of hero." Frank felt his throat tighten. "Your mom is pretty smart." Zoe nodded emphatically. "The smartest and the strongest. But she was really sad after the bad men came. She cried at night. I heard her." She looked up at Frank with eyes too old for her age. "But since you've been here, she smiles more. I think you make her feel safe." Before Frank could respond, Carolyn appeared in the doorway. "Bedtime, Zoe. Say goodnight to Frank." Zoe hugged him carefully, avoiding his injury, and skipped off to brush her teeth. Carolyn lingered, leaning against the doorframe. "She's right, you know. You do make me feel safe. Which is ironic, considering I barely know you." "You know the important parts," Frank said. "The parts that matter." Carolyn smiled, and for a moment they just looked at each other, the weight of everything unsaid hanging in the air between them. Then she straightened. "Get some rest. Tomorrow we can start talking about the future, if you want to." "I want to," Frank said, surprising himself. "I think I'm ready to try." That night, Frank slept without nightmares for the first time in 8 years. When he woke, sun was streaming through the windows, and he could hear Zoe laughing somewhere in the house. He got up slowly, his side still sore but manageable, and found his way to the kitchen. Carolyn was making pancakes, her hair pulled back, an apron over her clothes. She looked up when he entered and smiled. "Good morning. How'd you sleep?" Frank poured himself coffee from the pot she'd left ready. "Better than I have in a long time." Zoe ran in, already dressed for school, and grabbed a pancake off the stack. "Mom, can Frank come to my school for career day? He's way cooler than Jesse's dad, who's an accountant." Carolyn laughed. "We'll see. Eat your breakfast properly, not standing up." Frank watched them, this small family that had somehow made room for him in their lives, and felt the last piece of the weight he'd carried begin to lift. He'd spent 8 years believing he didn't deserve forgiveness, that the only path forward was penance and invisibility. But maybe Carolyn was right. Maybe the way to honor Danny's memory wasn't to disappear, but to keep doing what he'd been trained to do. To protect. To serve. To be there when someone needed help, even when it was terrifying, especially when it was terrifying. "Frank?" Carolyn was looking at him with concern. "You okay?" He set down his coffee cup and met her eyes. "Yeah, I think I am. And about that security position, I'm in. If the offer still stands." Carolyn's smile could have lit up the entire room. "It stands. It absolutely stands." Zoe cheered, nearly knocking over her orange juice. "Does this mean you're staying? Like for real?" Frank looked at the little girl who'd run to him in a hallway, who'd trusted him when she had no reason to, who'd seen him as a hero when he'd only seen himself as a failure. "Yeah," he said. "For real." 3 months later, Frank stood in his new office on the 15th floor of Barrett Industries, reviewing security protocols for an upcoming board meeting. The space was smaller than Carolyn's, but well appointed, with windows overlooking the city and a door that actually had his name on it. Director of Security. It still felt surreal sometimes, like he was playing a role in someone else's life. But the work was real, and it mattered, and for the first time in years, Frank felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. His phone buzzed, a text from Carolyn. "Dinner tonight? Zoe wants to show you her science project." Frank smiled and typed back, "I'll bring dessert." Another buzz, this time from Detective Morris. "Konstantin extradited from Morocco. Trial starts next month. You'll need to testify." Frank had known this was coming. The idea of standing in a courtroom, recounting what happened, facing the men he'd fought, it should have terrified him. Maybe it did. A little. But he'd testified in trials before, back in his CIA days. He knew how to handle it. And this time, he wouldn't be alone. Carolyn had already said she'd be there, both as a witness and as support. A knock on his door pulled him from his thoughts. One of the new security team members, a former police officer named Bryce, stuck his head in. "Got a minute, boss? Want to run the new access protocols by you?" Frank waved him in, and they spent the next 20 minutes going over details, troubleshooting potential weak points, building systems that would keep people safe. It was good work, important work, the kind of work that let Frank sleep at night. When Bryce left, Frank stood at his window, looking out over the city. Somewhere out there, people were making mistakes, carrying guilt, convinced they didn't deserve a second chance. He understood that. He'd lived it. But he also knew now that redemption wasn't something you earned through suffering. It was something you built, day by day, choice by choice, by showing up and doing the work even when you were scared. Danny would have approved. Frank could almost hear his partner's voice, teasing him for taking so long to figure it out, proud that he finally had. The guilt wasn't gone completely. Maybe it never would be. But it had transformed into something else. A reminder. A motivation. A reason to keep moving forward instead of hiding in the past. His phone buzzed again. Zoe this time, a photo of her with a model volcano and a grin that took up half her face. The caption read, "It's gonna explode, and it's gonna be awesome." Frank laughed out loud and saved the photo. Then he packed up his things, locked his office, and headed for the elevator. He had a dinner to get to, a science project to admire, and a life to live. Finally, after 8 years of exile, Frank Hayward was home.